Greetings, welcome back to CS195 Web Development. This is week 6, CSS Layouts Part 1. We're on the lesson box model. And if you remember from last lesson, we went over sizing elements and then managing overflow. What I want you to explain and think about is, what is overflow? So with that, our objective is to understand the box model, right? What is it? And then, like a lot of CSS, how do we manipulate it? How do we change it? So a success criteria is demonstrating adding a CSS rule that changes the padding of an element and then add a border to that element, right? So that's your goal. We'll watch a video on that. There is a lovely photo here and a lot of other places that help you with this, which we'll get to in a little bit as well. But as mentioned last lesson, the backgrounds are going to help us kind of see this the most. So let's watch the video real quick, and then we'll test it out and talk a little bit more about it.
You know how we made something that looked like a box in the last talk through by making this div and then giving it a background color? Well, actually, every element on your web page is considered a box by the browser, whether or not it looks like a box to you. This heading is a box, this paragraph is a box, even the span that we made is a box. Some of the boxes are big, some are small, some are inline, like the span, some are block, like the div, but they're all considered boxes.
So let's go look at the span real quick, because a lot of people are like, what? Why is the span something? So again, it has a background color, or has a color. So let's go ahead and give it a background color. Again, this is the word love right here. Background, and let's give it black because it's already something else. So again, it's a box. See that box around it? That is the size of the element. Again, every single thing is a box, and they can be boxes inside of boxes, so this is a box too, and that's probably, it might actually go out to like over here, sometimes that's what they do. But then again, it's a box. So that's what she's talking about. Every little thing is a box.
Why does this matter? Because of something called the box model, which you can see in the diagram I just pasted in. Every element's box has 4 parts: the actual content, the padding, the border, and the margin. We can use CSS to modify the padding, border, and margin, so you'll understand soon what those really are. Let's start with the margin. That's the transparent area around the box that separates the box from other elements. We'll specify margin using our favorite unit, pixels. To add 15 pixels of margin on every side of the official info box, we can just write margin 15 pix. See the change that made? What if we want a different amount of margin on each side, like more on the top bottom than the left right? We can write those amounts in clockwise order, starting from the top. So top 15 pix, right 0 pix, bottom 10 pix, left 6 pix. Or we can use specific properties for each.
Again, so hopefully you're catching that. You're seeing this moving around. Margin is the outside, right? So when we go back to that box model, margin is the outside of this. And this is why it's good to have this background on it, right? If she took the background off, it would be a lot harder to see where that margin was getting changed around at. So that's why a lot of times we have that background, just so we can kind of see it moved away from and where exactly the edges of it are. So again, margin is on the outside.
Each side, if we only want to specify a few sides. Like if we want to have some space around the cat picture on the right, and then we also just want some on the bottom.
So again, she added it around here specifically, the right and the bottom, adding some space around the outside of the photo. Pictures are pretty easy to figure out the edges because it's just the outside of it, right? So the outside of the picture is that.
And we're happy to have the default margin for the other sides. There's also a special value for margin that will help us do something fancy with our pages. To show you that, I'm going to add a div around the entire page, give it an ID of container. Let's put this tag here so it contains everything. Now, I'm gonna add a rule for that div to give it a width of 400 pixels. And I want to center it on the page. I could specify a margin left 100 pixels because that looks centered to me.
But that doesn't look centered to us, right? We have this big old gap here and then a little gap over here. So notice again, she gave it a width, so now that's 400 pixels.
But it may not look centered to you because your browser might be bigger or smaller. What we want is to be able to say, give it however much margin it needs so that it's got equal margin on both sides. That is exactly what margin auto does. And it's a great way to center divs on a page.
I've used this quite a bit as well. We'll go over some other issues in the advanced, other methods in the advanced CSS layouts, but margin auto is kind of a nice little way to get stuff to go through. I think this is still a little bit too big to really change. I can't really move that around. We'll play around with margin auto in a little bit. It's another way, because text align doesn't always work, right? It's meant for text, so I mean you can sometimes get it to work, but it doesn't always work, and it might give you weird features, especially with bullets. If you text align them, the words will go in the center, but the bullets won't. So this margin auto is kind of a neat thing. But again, CSS is so finicky. As we go through this, you'll see you need to really understand what you're doing. You got to be able to move the page around to different views, different sizes, and see what happens, because people have different size browsers, different size monitors, and it might look good on yours, but not so good as soon as you do anything else.
Now that we've centered that div, we might want to make it even more distinct by adding a border around the edge of it using the CSS border property. Let's add a red border to that div. We type border, and then we need to specify 3 aspects of the border: thickness, style, and color. For a thin border, we can just type 1 pix. For a solid line, nothing fancy, we'll just type solid. And to make it red, I'll pop in my RGB color picker and pick a nice fiery red.
You see that on the outside of it.
Just like with margin, we can specify the border for just like one side. Like if we want a really thick purple border on the top, we'll add another property. Border top 10 pix solid purple. Cool. Now let's add a frame to the image and play around with border styles. So going up to our cute cat. Let's see, border 6 pix. Let's try groove red. Okay, no, I don't like groove. Let's try double. Let's try ridge. Aha, now that looks like a frame. Okay, how about a border around our official info? Let's see, border, let's not make it too big, 2 pixels. Let's try dotted, and then let's pick just a subtle gray.
All right, so should probably change it a little bit, but I want you to kind of pay attention to this, because as I mentioned, this gray area is inside the border, right? Is inside of the border. So if you add a border, it goes on the outside of it, as you can see, and the margin, which you saw, she adds some margin to the bottom of this and the outside of it. The margin is on the outside of it. So one thing to think about is if you increase the padding, you're going to increase the background. You're going to actually increase the inside of the area, right? The border just goes on is this little edge between the two, and then margin does not increase the size of the background. It just kind of spaces the object away from it. So these are key things to understand when you're doing this to get the results you expect. And yes, there are some times that she could use margin here to make something move across, or she can use padding. Like a great example is this box right here, this space right here. She already used margin on this to move it away, this little space right here. But she could have also, if she's going to go, use the padding on the object on the outside to kind of push this in. So there are a lot of times that you can use either or. It's just what makes the most sense and what's going to change when you make the resize the object. What's going to happen?
Let me try dashed instead. Okay, that's what I want. Now with all these borders, something is bothering me a little.
What bothers me all the time is all those square borders. Now you don't ever need to use this. Sometimes it's fun, but if you use border, radius, spell radius right, and I don't know, sometimes I just start with 5 pixels to see what it is. We see how I gave a nice little curve. And you don't always want to do this, but you can go really far with this. And see a nice bigger curve, although I already broke the nice little arrow, so I wouldn't do that if I had an arrow in it. Or I could add the margin to kind of compensate for it, or add padding, which is about to teach us how to do. Which was way too much. Let's try 15. So it looks like it fits in it a little bit better. But I'm going to move that because you can go really, really, really crazy with this and almost make it a circle, right? So at some point, I think it stops actually doing anything. But that's border radius you can use to go ahead and do something like that if you're so inclined.
Actually, something's bothering me a lot. See how the text is butting up next to the border in the container and butting against the text in the official info? That's so gross looking, and it makes it harder to read the text. That is where padding comes in. Whenever your elements have background colors or borders, you'll almost always want to add padding to put a bit of space between the contents and the edges. Let's add some padding to the container. Let's do 15 pixels all around the container. Oh, so much better. Let's add some padding to our official info. Let's see, padding 6 pixels. Oh, beautiful. We don't need to add padding to the image since images actually look good inside frames like that. And there you have it, the box model.
All right, so what we're going to do is try this out. Again, this picture is immensely helpful. You'll see it a lot. Let's be honest, it took me a while to remember which one's padding, which one's margin. And every so often I still kind of forget and have to come back and look at it. But for the most part, you remember margins on the outside, padding's on the inside, but I don't expect you to remember it. I expect you, though, how to figure this out because this image is all over the internet. Again, you just say Google CSS margin, and it'll probably get you this photo, or at least explain that it's on the outside, and therefore, by default, padding's on the inside. So let's try this out. Full screen, follow along with me. Full size, we'll pull this off the side. Again, give it backgrounds, so we give stuff backgrounds. We'll kind of play around with different things. I'm tabbing this over, so let's go ahead and give this a background as well. Background blue, and I'm gonna back this off because it's killing me. So again, remember this blue is taking up this whole space, right? We went over that last time. The blue is taking up the whole space. So if we use the outside, this is where I'm going to show you that things kind of get the same outside. You also notice that I did a paragraph down there to show you that paragraphs already kind of have some padding and margin stuff to them as we go through, because as we're going to do this, it's going to start to override everything, right? So she said the outside. So let's do the outside of the size, right? So the div. So the outside of this is going to be out of here. So let's give it some margin. Let's do 10px. Should be able to see that. All right, so you see the gap there. I mean, if we need to make it a little bit bigger, 20. Should start seeing that we have a nice little gap around the outside of this. Kind of shrunk everything inside. But we could also do some padding on the outside of the paragraphs. I mean, this is going to give us, as I was talking about, stuff gives you different results because some items already have some of their own stuff. So if I do padding, let's do 10px here. Not padding, margin, sorry. Margin, do margin, not padding, margin. Oh, sure, I hope I spell it right. All right, so again, notice how it added that space. Notice how it also actually shrunk this space because the paragraph already had some margin above it. That's what it was doing. So we got margin, we have margin, and then it created a margin in between each of these elements, right? So margin 10 pixels gave us this margin because that's pushing away from it, right? it's actually the outside of the red. Remember, these are all. So each of these individual ones, it's adding the margin to all of them, and they are the red. So on the outside of the red, we have 10. On the outside of the blue, we have 20. And this is what I was talking about. I'm going to delete this because we can also do this with a different property. All right, so we talked about padding. So if I do padding, and not on this one, if I do padding on this one, we're going to get very similar results. But notice how it went all around. And notice how there's padding on both sides. There's margin on both sides of this paragraph. And then we added more padding around it. So again, you get different results. They kind of do the same thing. Padding on size made space here. Again, let's go, we'll all cut it and paste it back over here to see the results of putting it, not padding, putting margin over here, right? So margin on all gives us this. And if we do padding on the outside, it gives us this. So again, they kind of accomplish the same thing, but very differently based on what they're trying to do, right? So again, realize that they can kind of do the same things. A margin on an inside element can kind of be padding on an outside element. So do be cognizant of that. Last thing I'm going to do is just go ahead and give this a border so you can see what that looks like. And then kind of show you again the padding and whatnot. So actually, I'm going to add it to this one. So line 11, let's add border, colon, remember the size. So let's do 2px, hopefully so you can see it. Let's just do solid, nothing anything fancy. Notice it automatically did black. And let's go ahead and change it to white. All right, so we hopefully can see that a little bit better. So this will also help us see some of the padding. So I'm going to take this padding off, right? Because this is going to help us see the inside and outside. I do like adding borders sometimes just so we can see that. So if I add margin, it's on the outside, right? If I add margin, it's on the outside. So margin 10px. So okay. Cool. Oh, and again, spelling this sure helps. So see, it's on the outside of the border. It doesn't add any space to the red. If I add padding, it's on the inside of this. And notice the red does increase, right? Just like that little area here we had. If we add padding, it's going to increase the background. Everything inside of that green is affected by the background. So that's about it. Just a box model. Everything is a box. You can do that with a span, as I showed you. So with this, there's a bunch of these. Do remember her order: top, right, bottom, left. That does come up here in a lot in the practices, and then do the challenge and the journal entry. And we'll see you next lesson.